Hey, it's good to be with you again in your beautiful part of the world. I think our ushers would love to give you Bibles, so if you would raise your hand just a little bit, ever so bashfully, our ushers will get you a Bible, and you could go ahead and find page 952 in there as we go. So, I found it a little bit amusing. A couple months ago, we moved from Hastings, Minnesota, up the river from you, to Wisconsin Rapids, and we still had those Minnesota plates on our car, and people thought that we must be Minnesotans. And I started counting, and I realized that I was moving to my 18th home in Wisconsin, in my 12th Wisconsin town. So that's how bad I am with being a Wisconsin person. My wife is actually from the Holy Land, near Green Bay. Village of Bondwell, 30 miles from Green Bay. I was raised in Rice Lake and Frederick, and I was brought up being told that I had relatives at La Crosse, including a great uncle who played the fiddle. I always wanted to meet him. I never met him. If you're my great uncle who played the fiddle, please come and meet me after the service. Even though you're probably 140 years old, I'll be over there by those steps. And seriously, I would love to meet any of you after the service. So it is good to be with you. So I've been hearing a lot lately about a really exciting young church. It had a great start. It has many gifted and talented people, and it became very famous very fast, though it does have some problems. For one thing, some of the people in this church are damaging the reputation of the gospel itself by filing lawsuits against each other in civil court. And that's ugly. But that's not their biggest problem. They have another problem. There's the whole matter of marriage and divorce. Some of their members are believers who are getting married to non-believers in Jesus, and they shouldn't be doing that. And then others who are believers are divorcing their spouses who are not believers, and they shouldn't be doing that. That's not their biggest problem. Actually, they have a number of additional serious problems. The patience with which they're treating their new Christians in their midst, the way they're using their spiritual gifts, the thoughtless, sloppy way they're doing communion, their sexual morality. They have many big, serious problems. But their biggest problem, more grievous to the pastor who started the church than any other, wouldn't you like to hear? Well, the first service didn't either, but I'm going to tell you anyway. I'm going to tell you anyway. Come with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 1. And again, that's page 952 in the Bibles that were passed out. And there's a place to put some notes on the back of the bulletin. Okay, so some of you have probably guessed that I'm actually talking about a church which is not exactly contemporary. It just sounds like it. I'm talking about the first century church at Corinth in Greece. When the man who started this church, the Apostle Paul, wrote this letter with all those other things on his mind, and they were, the problem we're about to read about was the number one thing on his mind, keeping him awake at night. Look at chapter 1, verse 10. Chapter 1, verse 10, after some pleasantries, he gets down to business and says, I appeal to you, brothers, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that all of you agree with one another, so that there may be no divisions among you, and that you may be perfectly united in mind and thought. What was the problem? Disunity, right? My brothers, some from Chloe's household have informed me that there are quarrels among you. What I mean is this. One of you says, I follow Paul. Another, I follow Apollos. Another, I follow Cephas, another name for Peter. And still another, I follow Christ. So here we go. Disunity over the pastor teachers who had come and gone from their congregational was their greatest problem. But let's give them a break. From a human standpoint, they're lining themselves up behind the pastors and teachers they had was kind of understandable in light of their extraordinary church history. Here's what I mean. Their church had been founded by Paul the Apostle himself, one of the founding fathers of Christianity. That's what I call the apostles. The guy after whom St. Paul, Minnesota was named. You know the guy? The guy who wrote about half of your New Testament. He had a deeper understanding of the teaching of the gospel than anybody on the planet. Nobody understood the gospel like him. And you could just wind him up and let him go, and he'd just teach the gospel all night long. Amazing. Having been baptized by Paul would be something to brag about. After Paul left, the prominent teacher who came and helped them out was a man named Apollos. And he is described as having been a learned man, mighty in the scriptures, and eloquent. And that was before he was even a Christian. This guy was the original sermonator, the crafter of phrases and sermons, an orator, somebody who was just a joy to listen to. I mean, even if you were a Buddhist, you liked listening to this guy. It was just so enjoyable. And for some reason that I can't explain, for some reason, when I think of this guy, I always picture the old Italian model Fabio. I don't know why, but that's what I picture. He's an old guy now, but maybe, seeing where we live, maybe Clay Matthews would be a better choice. I don't know, but that's what I picture. So people being people, naturally there were people who liked hearing Paul better. They liked the fire hose down the throat method, and there were people who liked hearing Apollos better. And then making it more complicated, some of these people had been exposed to the preaching of the Apostle Peter, who at this point in his life has an itinerant, there he is, okay? Peter has an itinerant ministry. He's going from town to town. And think about Peter as a preacher. He would have been bold and direct and emotional and zealous and passionate. And he was a fisherman, and that means he was a storyteller, right? Oh man, think of the fish stories this guy had to tell. And I'm sure he did. There was a time he caught so many fish because of Jesus that his boat was sinking. Sounds like a tall tale, doesn't it? And then there was Jesus and his all-you-can-eat fish fries. And then paying his taxes by catching a fish and pulling a coin out of its mouth. And it was enough to pay his taxes. And then walking on the water, and he wasn't even ice fishing. And then there was Jesus in Luke 24 eating a piece of fish in front of him left over from Good Friday just to prove that he really had a real resurrection body. And then finally from John 21, Jesus making a fish breakfast. I love fish for breakfast. Jesus made a fish breakfast for all of the apostles. Just one story after another. Must have been a blast to listen to Peter. And then compounding the problem even more, some of these people had very possibly, from what we see here, been to the Holy Land itself and maybe heard Jesus, maybe been baptized by the very disciples of Jesus themselves. Amazing. So some of these people were saying, well, I got saved listening to Paul. And then other people were saying, well, I became a believer listening to the melodious tones of Apollos. And then somebody else says, well, I got baptized by Peter. And then somebody else says, that's nothing. I became a Christian listening to Jesus Christ. So there. You get it? So under the circumstances, maybe their disunity was understandable, but not to Paul. Not to Paul. Look at verse 13. Verse 13. And I need your help now with an unusual responsive reading. Okay? There are three questions in this verse, And Paul is just expecting you to be thinking, of course not. So I'm going to ask you, if you would please, with all the sarcasm that you can muster, and I've talked to your mother and I know you can do this, I want you to answer, of course not. Will you do that, please? So here we go. This is verse 13. Is Christ divided?
Of course not.
Was Paul crucified for you?
Of course not.
Were you baptized in the name of Paul?
Of course not.
You get it. Look at verse 14 as he continues. 14. He says, I'm actually thankful I didn't baptize any of you except Crispus and Gaius, so no one can say that you were baptized into my name. Now, Paul certainly loved baptizing people, but in this situation, he's glad he didn't baptize anymore. Yes, he remembers, I also baptized the household of Stephanas. Beyond that, I don't remember if I baptized anyone else, for Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, not with words of human wisdom, lest the cross of Christ be emptied of its power. And at this point, Paul goes down a long rabbit trail from here to the end of chapter 2 about words of human wisdom, or your translation might say eloquent wisdom, as opposed to the simple gospel of the cross of Christ. He doesn't mean he's not knocking wisdom in the Old Testament sense of help from heaven for life on earth. He's talking about what we call knowledge. And he's talking about it not that knowledge is bad, but that as preachers, we all have all sorts of extraneous knowledge of other areas of life, other areas of learning that we bring into our preaching. It makes our preaching very, very different from one another, and people being people. Some people like to hear this preacher because he talks about psychology, and some people like to hear that preacher because he talks about science, and some people like to hear this preacher because he tells funny stories or whatever. It's the same way today. I don't have much for fish stories. Pastor Billy probably has some because he was going after trout last Sunday afternoon. What I have are lots and lots of unhealthy pastor church stories. Okay? Funny thing, but my relatives don't want to hear them. And if they do, they don't want to go to church. So anyway, in the process of talking about human wisdom, he introduces by the end of chapter 2 the concept of spiritual people and unspiritual people. Spiritual people and unspiritual people. And we're going to come back to that subject next week and explain what it had to do with their disunity problem. For now, I simply want to read for you from chapter 3, verse 1. If you would find chapter 3, verse 1, where he comes back to the subject of disunity over the pastors and teachers who had come and gone from their church. So look at chapter 3, verse 1. Brothers, I could not address you as spiritual, but as worldly, mere infants in Christ. I gave you milk, not solid food, for you were not yet ready for it. Indeed, you are still not ready. You are still worldly. What's the proof of that, Paul? Here it is. For since there is jealousy and quarreling among you, are you not worldly? Are you not acting like mere men? He means people who have not been born again. He says, for when one says, I follow Paul, and another, I follow Apollos, are you not? And he means acting like mere men. So we cut them some slack, but Paul clearly finds the disunity of the Corinthians absolutely unacceptable. But fortunately for us, angry or not, Paul takes the time to give the Corinthians some teaching they badly needed. In fact, here in chapter 3, he gives them 3 illustrations. I love these illustrations to help them understand the coming and going of pastors. What he shares here is absolutely priceless. I have been so helped by it. I have seen many churches greatly helped by it. When pastors come and go, whatever the reasons, whatever the issues have been, it's hard. It's weird. One of your members who was in the first service says, it's like divorce. And it does feel like divorce. And we're asking, why does this have to happen? Why do we have to go through this? And so we really need to understand, from God's vantage point, what's happening when pastors come and go from our churches. Let me illustrate the need. In May of 2003, 16 years ago, Memorial Day weekend, actually I preached a sermon at my church in Grafton, north of Milwaukee. Donna and I had been members there for 17 years. I had been a pastor there for 13. It was time for me to move on. It wasn't bad, but it was definitely time. And I preached this kind of swan song sermon. And before I did it, I felt that Donna and I should meet one-on-one, two-on-two with a few people who were likely going to have a really hard time with this announcement and probably should hear it before the sermon. So we talked to some folks, and I'll tell you about a couple of them next week. And we weren't entirely accurate in who we talked to. People who, might be really attached to us, people with abandonment issues, that kind of thing. And I preached the sermon, and we got done with the service, and I remember in particular there was one gal, our doctor's wife, and we knew she liked us, and we liked her a lot too, but we didn't know the extent to which she was attached to us and saw us as parental figures. But there she was at the end of the service in the third row, and the service is over and everybody gets up and leaves, and she just sat there like a stone. And I went to talk to her, and I found out what a big blow this really was to her. She was having a hard time. And in the years since then, we have seen church after church in transition between pastors trying to sort this stuff out. Good people really struggling, asking, what is going on? What is God up to? And of course, the challenge is much, much greater if we think that our pastor's departure was somehow unjust or unfair. Then it really gets hard, doesn't it? Been there. So I hear from various bloggers, all kinds of things come across my computer, and one of my favorite people to hear from is a great Southern Baptist named Chuck Lawless. And just as I was working on this, he sent out a blog post, an article called 8 Reasons Church Pain Can Be the Worst Pain. 8 Reasons Church Pain Can Be the Worst Pain. I actually have some copies of this with me if anybody wants one, but here they are. I'm just going to throw them out. Number 1, we expect better. I mean, this is the church. 2, we're seldom prepared for it. 3, we love God's people deeply even. God's people can be great sometimes. We don't understand it. Why would God's people act like they do? 5, we look to the church for peace, not for pain. 6, it affects a big part of our lives. If we're really invested in a church, then it's a really big deal to us. 7, it often doesn't make sense. And 8, it just gets old. Meaning, if you've been through this kind of thing before, it just really gets old. Got it. So with that said, we're going to turn to the 3 illustrations, and we're going to start with the last one, because I'm just weird, that's all. So we start with the 3rd illustration, in which Bethany Church is God's temple. Bethany Church is God's temple. He's not talking about buildings. He's not saying we should change the name of our church to such and such a temple, but in a sense we are. This one is short and sweet. Look at verse 16. Would you find 16? Don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple. He's not speaking to us as individuals here as God's temple. That's in chapter 6. Here he's talking to churches. You are God's temple, and that God's Spirit lives in you. If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him. For God's temple is sacred, or your Bible may say, holy, and you are that temple. There's really only one point being made here, and that is churches are holy. Churches are holy. But there are implications here. The first implication is that there is nothing more important than getting a pastor who reveres God and understands the church doesn't belong to him. Now, we kind of lightly, we will talk about John MacArthur's church or Chuck Swindoll's church or John Piper's church or somebody else's church, Andy Stanley's church. But in truth, we know better than that. They all belong to God. They were purchased with the blood of Christ, according to Acts 20 and 1 Peter, and there's no question about who they belong to. So, I was a new pastor at that church that I just described to you, north of Milwaukee, back in the early 90s, and we were having a great time as I was the new pastor. We were enjoying what my wife and I call a new pastor revival and having a great time. And a denominational leader friend of mine visited one Sunday morning, and he could see that it was going well, and he got me aside afterwards, and he said, "Brian, you got a good thing going here. Don't mess it up." And I took that really seriously. That became my number one goal, just to not mess it up. That's all. Second implication here is that the temple is more important than the priests of the temple. The temple is more important than the priests of the temple. As Paul writes this, the Jerusalem temple is still standing, and priests have been coming and going for almost 1,000 years. So last week, all eyes of the world were on Notre Dame as it burned in Paris. Just think of how many priests have come and gone from Notre Dame since the 12th century when it was built. The temple is more important than the priests of the temple. And there's a third implication here. Actually, it's more than an implication. Paul just says, God will deal with you if you mess up my temple. God will deal with those who destroy his churches. Every church of every size is sacred, belongs to God. So with that said, we're going to go back to the first illustration. In the first illustration, Bethany Church is God's field. Bethany Church is God's field. And we're back to verse 5. I'm going to read this passage. I want to ask you to follow along and see how much you can see. See how much you notice as we read it. It's a great illustration. So here we go. What, after all, is Apollos? And what is Paul? And he answers the question. Only servants. What kind, Paul? Through whom, I got to find it again, through whom you came to believe, as the Lord has assigned to each his task. I planted the seed, Apollos watered it, but God made it grow. So neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but only God who makes things grow. The man who plants and the man who waters have one purpose, and each will be rewarded according to his own labor. For we are God's fellow workers. You are God's field. And we stop right there at the comma. Okay, did you notice from this passage, as we've already mentioned, God is the only owner of every church. Churches do not belong to their members. And we get pretty ridiculous sometimes. We get in a kerfuffle with each other and we say stupid things like, yeah, well, I'm not going to let you destroy my church. You heard that? Or, well, I've been working here for 40 years and I'm not going to let you wreck my church. I mean, when we say things like that, we are fraudulent posers, pretending to own something which we don't own. It's not ours. Did you notice in this passage that God sovereignly, that means like a king, providentially, that means he uses all kinds of circumstances, which are not circumstantial or happenstantial, they're providential. God uses all kinds of things to move pastors and teachers on and off the field. He uses everything from conflicts, counsel from board members, counsel from denominational leaders, counsel from spouses, troubled family situations, health situations, new opportunities, new passions, innumerable things to move pastors and teachers on and off the field. These teachers, even if they don't like each other, are fellow workers with one another. They are not competitors. They have specialized tasks to perform. Some of them are planters, Paul says. Some are waterers. We could say some are fertilizers. Some are detasselers. Some are cultivators. Some are harvesters as we come and go. By the way, please don't use the term permanent pastor, because we only have one permanent pastor, and that's Jesus. The rest of us are interim pastors, truth be told. So it brings us to a question. The question being, how long should pastorates actually be? So a friend of mine, and some of you may know him, John Herman, has worked for the Free Church for many years. He wrote a great little article called Right Length Pastorates. Right Length Pastorates. And in it, he said pastorates shouldn't necessarily be short or long or medium. They should be the right length, long enough to accomplish the task that God brought him there to do. And when you're no longer wanted or you're no longer effective, either one, it's time to move on. Right length pastorates. Did you notice from our passage that God is the only one who makes any church grow ever, in one sense of the word, and it's in there. It's there. Some people don't like hearing me say this, but in one sense of the word, we preachers are nothing. We're holy nobodies. In fact, in the illustration, we are what kind of workers? What kind of servants are we? We're migrant workers, right? Isn't that the picture? Migrant workers are high status people, right? Not exactly. Not exactly. Never have been. But here's our honor. We get to work with God. We get to work with God. We are God's fellow workers, he says. We get to cultivate miracles. And that's really great. Are there any farmers in here this morning? Could I see your hand? Nah, one hand. All right. Are there any gardeners here this morning? Could I see your hands? All right. I don't like to do that stuff, but I like to eat what you grow. I mean, some of it, at least. Most of it. So, here's what I hear. Hey, I love doing this. I get to work with God. I till the soil and I put the seeds in and I put some water on there and wow, God does the rest. And those of us in ministry get to do the same thing. Every Christian who participates in ministry gets to work with God. And the claim to fame of full-time people in ministry is just that we get to do more of it. That's all. But it's working with God. We cultivate miracles. Did you notice from the passage? God will reward each of us perfectly. It's in verse 8. He sees what we're doing. He knows what we're doing. In chapter 4, he goes into that further and he says, don't think you could judge preachers like this one's doing a lot and this one isn't. He says at the judgment seat of Christ, God will show who has really done a lot, and he'll take the motives of our hearts into consideration as he does it. Now, folks, I'm not going to say that you shouldn't be sad that you've lost a pastor who was here for 18 years. It's hard. It's hard. But you have to admit with me from this chapter that from 30,000 feet, and actually God is way beyond 30,000 feet, right? From God's vantage point, one pastor leaving and another coming is just a change of migrant workers. One getting his work done and another taking his place. We're going to come back to the second illustration next week, but meanwhile, Paul's illustrations point us to two powerful implications. And the first one is pretty obvious and easy. Dividing up over our human leaders is a mark of spiritual immaturity. It's kid stuff. In the next chapter, he's going to talk about taking pride in one against the other, which is what he was describing. That's kid stuff. I want to state it positively. So here's a positive version of the same thing. Positively stated, the healthiest churches, the best churches, are disciple-making ministries, disciple-making, active, effective bodies of Christ in their own communities, which are not dependent upon their superstar pastors for their success. Their pastors can come and go, and they just keep right on making disciples without even missing a beat. Isn't that what we want? Yes, I'll say it myself. Yes, we do. Yes, we do. And that brings us to a dream that I have for you. And you might think it's kind of bold, it's kind of cheeky for me to come down here and give you a goal. But here it is. Here it is. Let's become a healthy, happy, holy, united, disciple-making church before we call our next long-term senior pastor. I commend to you this as a godly goal. Let's become a healthy, happy, holy, united, disciple-making church before we call our next long-term senior pastor. And that brings us to a second implication. Churches belong to God, who gives them a succession of servant leaders who help them grow into what He wants them to be. Churches belong to God, who gives them a succession of servant leaders who helps them grow into what He wants them to be. And here's where I'm going to plead with you. Here's where I beg. If you've trusted Jesus with your life, if you've trusted Him with your soul, if you've trusted Him with your eternity, please trust Him with your church. Trust Him with your church. Now, I know the elephant in the room. By the way, I am an elephant slayer. I go after them. The elephant in the room is that your pastor was asked to leave. And some of you are glad. And some of you are sad. And some of you are mad. And some of you are relieved. And all of those emotions are legitimate right now. They really are. It begs the question, how do I trust God for the coming and going of my pastors if I don't trust the people who ask the pastors to come or go? And we're going to deal with that really honestly next week. Next week. And next week I'm going to tell you about my friend Jeff. I can't wait to tell you about Jeff. And I'm going to tell you about my friend Gus. And I'm going to tell you about my friend, I'm going to call him Fred. And I'm going to tell you the Oscar Mayer story next week, right here. The two implications lead us to two prayers. And the first prayer looks like this. I guess we got them both. Dear God, please make Bethany a healthy, happy, holy, united, disciple-making church for your glory. If you can sincerely pray that, would you pray that out loud with me right now? Dear God, please make Bethany a healthy, happy, holy, united, disciple-making church for your glory. There's a second prayer. Here's what it is. Don't pray it with me yet. Dear God, this one's harder. You have every right and my permission to rearrange my life and my church, really, at any time to fulfill your plan for your glory. If you can really pray that, Would you pray that with me now? Dear God, you have every right and my permission to rearrange my life and my church at any time to fulfill your plan for your glory. I'd love to meet you. I'll be down there at the